The fact that he had been a collaborator on numerous African projects gave him the impression that the rules did not apply to him. He immediately demanded an upgrade. The boarding agents bustled about, whispered, checked their tablets. But the reality was simple. Business class was full. Every seat was taken. Nevertheless, the CEO persisted with his request. That's when the airline called upon an experienced cabin chief. Tall, Caucasian, dressed in an Air France uniform, her name was Claire. A cold, forced smile played on her lips as she boarded to resolve the situation. Once inside, Claire scanned the cabin with a sharp eye, as if searching for something or someone. Her gaze lingered for a moment on a dark-skinned man seated in 2A. Ibrahim Traoré was quietly engrossed in reading on his phone, unflappable as always. She observed more closely. No luxury watch, no assistant, no outward signs of power, just a black man in a hoodie. She leaned toward another crew member and whispered, "Probably a mistake." She approached him, forced a smile, and asked politely but firmly, "Sir, may I see your boarding pass, please?" Traoré looked up, nodded, and handed her the document. She stared at the pass, then turned her attention back to him. The seat number was correct, but a persistent intuition nagged at her. To her, he didn't seem to belong. Moments later, she returned with a feigned smile, this time more direct. "Sir, I'm sorry, but we may need to relocate you to accommodate another passenger. Would you agree to move to economy class? We'll compensate you for the inconvenience." It was an affront, subtle but stinging. Ibrahim Traoré raised an eyebrow. "And why me?" he asked calmly. "No particular reason, sir," she replied, trying to maintain her composure. "Just a small adjustment for our guest." "A guest more important than me?" he asked, his voice still steady. Claire fell silent, offering only a smile. Other passengers glanced over, sensing something was amiss, but no one said a word. Ibrahim, for his part, simply sat back and declared, "No, I'm staying in my seat." The tension was beginning to rise, but the storm had not yet broken. Claire was stunned. No, a man like him standing up to her. She wasn't used to this, especially not from an African passenger, and certainly not during her shift. She forced another smile, but her pride was wounded. "Sir, I must insist. It's for operational reasons," she said, her tone slightly colder. But Traoré didn't budge. He looked her straight in the eyes. "If it's operational, please explain why I'm being asked and not someone else." Claire hesitated. She wasn't prepared for this kind of calm resistance. Around them, a few business-class passengers were now paying attention. A man lowered his newspaper. A woman stopped typing on her laptop. Something didn't seem right, but no one spoke. No one dared. The CEO still hadn't boarded. He was held at the gate until a seat could be found. Claire quickly headed to the cockpit, whispered something to the captain, then returned with a decision. She didn't say a word to Traoré this time. Instead, she approached another black man in business class, then another. She was clearly targeting only the passengers who didn't seem to belong. That was her second mistake. Traoré remained silent and watched. His face was impassive, but his mind was sharp. He observed, calculated, listened. The humiliation didn't anger him. It focused him. A young African man, perhaps in his late 20s, looked confused when Claire now pointed to his seat. "You, sir, we need you to move to economy class." The young man asked, "Why?" Claire stayed silent, merely taking his boarding pass. That's when Traoré stood up. "Enough," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority. "You're making decisions based on skin color, not tickets. That's called discrimination." Claire turned, visibly shaken. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to sit down. Please don't make a scene." Traoré locked eyes with her for a moment. Her breath caught. There was something in his gaze. Steady, fearless, powerful. But she still had no idea who he really was. To her, he was just another passenger, acting like a troublemaker. She walked away again, seething inwardly. To her, the situation was spiraling out of control. "These people," she muttered in French, "always making a fuss." The CEO was finally brought on board. Claire greeted him with exaggerated politeness, offering him a glass of champagne. "We're resolving the seating issue, sir," she said. Meanwhile, Traoré sat back down. He fastened his seatbelt, his fingers tapping calmly on the armrest. He didn't need to say a word, for soon the entire world would know what had just happened and who had been insulted. The CEO settled into business class like a king reclaiming his throne. He didn't even glance at Ibrahim Traoré as he passed by. Claire, the flight attendant, ensured he was comfortable, adjusting his seat, handing him warm towels, and offering another glass of champagne. The message was clear. You matter. That man doesn't. The plane taxied down the runway and soon took off into the sky, leaving French soil behind but carrying with it a moment that would soon shake two nations. Inside the cabin, everything seemed normal. Passengers relaxed, the seatbelt signs turned off. But beneath the surface, something powerful was brewing, an invisible storm waiting to erupt. Traoré remained calm. He didn't complain, didn't raise his voice, didn't call anyone, and didn't reveal his identity. He simply sat quietly, like a man watching a movie unfold, knowing exactly how it would end. Meanwhile, Claire avoided looking at him. Something about his presence made her uneasy, but she pushed the feeling aside. Mid-flight, she returned to his seat with a forced smile. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" He glanced at her briefly. "Water's fine." She nodded quickly and walked away. No apologies, no courtesy, no respect. The CEO, on the other hand, was treated like a celebrity. Claire laughed at his jokes, leaned in when he spoke, and inquired about his important projects in Africa. He responded arrogantly, "Burkina Faso is lucky to have us. We bring order to chaos." Claire nodded, completely unaware that the very man he was insulting was sitting just 2 rows away. A woman in the cabin, an African nurse returning home to Bobo Dioulasso, noticed everything. She shook her head and whispered to her neighbor, "That's our president. They don't even know who they're humiliating." Her neighbor's eyes widened in disbelief, but she said nothing. The president clearly didn't want to draw attention, and no one wanted to break the silence. Hours passed, the lights dimmed. Most passengers slept. But Ibrahim Traoré stayed awake, gazing out the window at the clouds. He wasn't angry. He was patient. And when the wheels touched down in Ouagadougou, that patience would become history. The plane began its slow descent toward Ouagadougou. The cabin lights came on. The captain announced the approach in French and English. Passengers stretched, fastened their seatbelts, and prepared to land. Claire walked down the aisle with her notepad, still smiling at passengers. The CEO, completely oblivious to Ibrahim Traoré, was mesmerized by the view. A golden sun shone over the red earth, while the city below awakened as the plane descended. What no one on board could yet guess was the convoy gathering on the tarmac. A row of black 4x4s, military vehicles, and a presidential escort in formation. In the cabin, murmurs began to spread, at first timidly. "I see soldiers. Are we landing in a war zone?" a foreign passenger asked nervously. No, it's military protocol," another replied. "Maybe an important figure is arriving." The French CEO smirked. "It must be for me," he chuckled to Claire. She laughed with him, already preparing to escort him out before the other passengers. She had even planned to personally accompany him to the terminal. But the plane had barely come to a stop when the atmosphere shifted entirely. Through the window, passengers caught sight of presidential guards in uniform lined up perfectly, weapons in hand, standing at maximum attention. Behind them stood Burkina Faso's highest ministers, the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and even the head of security, all motionless in the heat, like statues of power. Claire glanced out the window and gasped. "What is that?" she whispered. The CEO stood proudly, smoothing his suit. "It's obviously for me, I told you. I'm involved in big projects here." But before anyone could disembark, a tall officer in a black beret boarded. His boots echoed on the floor as he slowly walked down the aisle, scanning every face. He stopped at seat 2A. He raised his hand to his forehead in a flawless military salute. "Mr. President, welcome home." A deathly silence fell over the entire cabin. You could have heard hearts stop beating. Claire's face collapsed, her eyes darting nervously from the officer to the man she had disrespected throughout the flight. Her hands began to tremble. Ibrahim Traoré stood slowly, calm, dignified, without a word. The CEO took a step back, his mouth slightly agape. President? He stammered. This man. Traoré turned and gave him a simple nod, without anger, without pride, just a man who no longer needed to say anything. Another officer stepped in. "We have instructions," he said coldly, looking at Claire and the CEO. "Both of you, you're coming with us immediately." "Wait, what?" Claire whispered. "Why me?" "You're under arrest for questioning," the officer replied sharply. "You publicly disrespected the head of state on national soil. That's a serious offense." Claire tried to laugh nervously, glancing around. No, there must be a mistake. I was doing my job." But no one was listening. Traoré stepped off the plane and was immediately greeted by his people, his guards, his ministers, and a cheering crowd beyond the airport gates. Cameras flashed. The nation's leader was back, but this time everyone knew the truth. He had walked among them as an ordinary man, and those who had judged him by his appearance would now face the consequences. Back on the plane, Claire and the CEO were both led away in handcuffs. Passengers watched, incredulous, as they disappeared down the steps, heads bowed, their arrogance shattered. And this was only the beginning. The tarmac burned under the Burkina Faso sun, but all eyes were on the two people being escorted in handcuffs. Claire, the Air France flight attendant, and the powerful French CEO. Gone were their smug smiles, gone was the arrogance. In their place, panic, confusion, and disbelief. They were led away, escorted into two separate black vehicles, surrounded by an elite presidential guard. No words were exchanged, not even with the officers. That silence weighed heavier than any shout. It was the silence of power reclaimed, of dignity defended. Inside the terminal, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before a small group of journalists. He spoke calmly, without apparent anger, but his words were powerful and unforgettable. "In Burkina Faso, we don't judge a man's worth by the color of his skin. We don't bow to money or old colonial habits. Here we respect dignity, humanity, and our people. That's the new Africa." The story spread like wildfire. Videos leaked online, images of the arrest, soldiers saluting Traoré, news clips showing the CEO dragged off the plane, looking like a child caught red-handed. Social media erupted. "Respect Africa" and "House broke, I stand with Burkina" became global trends. African youth across the continent celebrated, cheering a moment they would never forget. At the Ministry of Justice, Claire and the CEO were formally charged with public insult and discrimination against the head of state, disrespect on Burkinabe soil, abuse of power, and attempted intimidation. The French embassy tried to intervene. Phone calls were made. Diplomatic requests poured in. But Traoré responded unequivocally, "This is not a colony. This is a sovereign nation. They will be judged like anyone else." Meanwhile, Air France scrambled to control the damage. The airline issued a press release within 24 hours, an awkward apology filled with corporate jargon and superficial regrets, but it wasn't enough. Burkinabe citizens began calling for a boycott. Other African countries joined the movement. Claire, now detained in a facility outside Ouagadougou, broke down in tears during her interrogation. "I didn't know who he was," she sobbed. "I was just following procedures." The investigator looked at her coldly. "You didn't need to know who he was. You just needed to treat him like a human being." The CEO, facing potential legal action in Burkina Faso and France, tried to leverage his influence to escape. But the court issued a strong ruling. No immunity, no special treatment. Let justice be equal for all. Traoré never gloated. He never mocked them. He simply returned to the presidential palace and continued his work, building roads, empowering youth, strengthening the military, defending the country. But that moment on the plane became a legend. A quiet man in a hoodie, a prejudiced flight attendant, a CEO blinded by his pride, and a landing that changed the game.